This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner for Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Michael Martin, Farm Service Agency Agricultural Program Specialist, begins today's show with an FSA update. Michael discusses FSA programs that are relevant to producers because of the current climate in Kansas. We continue the show with K-State Farm System Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti to share about chilling injury in corn and how the cold impacted soybeans. Ignacio explains the importance of checking fields before making decisions. Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts concludes today's show as Bob White, Brian Lubbers, and Dustin Pendell discuss disease challenges. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we are beginning today's show with an FSA update. And joining us for that is Farm Service Agency Agricultural Program Specialist Michael Martin. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
I think, Michael, a good place to start with this. It's rained in the past few weeks. However, Kansas isn't not in a drought anymore. So for Kansas producers who have been impacted by the drought and are possibly having failed wheat acreage, what would you like to tell them about what can the Farm Service Agency provide for them?
First thing, if they have crop insurance and they think they have a loss, obviously you should reach out to your agent and file a claim or notify them that you think you have a loss. Secondly, through FSA, producers can come in and request a failed acreage credit through the Farm Service Agency. If they want to do that, they need to file a FSA 576 notice of loss form. It's not a requirement that they do that, but, failed acreage credit may come into play in a future farm bill for acreage reporting purposes or cropping history. Also, we never know when Congress may pass any ad hoc disaster programs. So, if they have failed wheat now and they turn that in, a few months, Congress could pass some legislation to assist producers with that. So it's my recommendation that if you have failed wheat, turn it into your crop insurance, but also report that to FSA. Now, if producers don't have crop insurance, then they would still need to file the form with FSA if they did want to get failed acreage credit history, but they do need to notify FSA prior to destruction of any crop.
You mentioned about reporting to the FSA the failed acreage and getting everything lined up. But before that, is there times and deadlines for producers to report what they have planted for the spring?
In Kansas, acreage reporting deadlines that we have in the state, we actually have 4 of them in Kansas, and they are November 15th is apiculture or beekeeping / honey production, and then December 15th is the deadline where producers would report their small grains that are seeded in the fall, such as wheat, triticale, winter barley, etc. And then July 15th is the spring planted acreage reporting deadline. So that would be sesame, corn, soybeans, grain sorghum, perennial forage such as alfalfa and grass, anything like that. And then we also have a July 31st deadline for hemp. That's a fairly new crop to the state. Not a lot of producers are growing that, but if they are growing it, July 31 is the deadline for that. Now, I will say on the July 15th deadline for 2023, that actually falls on a weekend. So typically in FSA world, if a deadline falls on a non-work day, it rolls to the next business day. So the deadline actually for 2023 acreage reporting would be July 17th due to the 15th falling on a weekend. I would encourage producers to report your planted acreage as soon as you can, and don't wait until July 15th. You can avoid the mad rush there towards the end and any delays with getting in the office.
So in this scenario, it's definitely worth being prompt and being on top of getting that paperwork and that reporting into the FSA office. If producers aren't able to get things planted due to drought or other weather-related conditions, is there something that FSA can help with on that front?
Yeah, so if producers are unable to plant, because of being dry, we have what we call prevented plant credit. And prevented planting in FSA's world, it's defined as the inability to plant the intended crop with the proper equipment by the final planting date because of a natural disaster. So normally what we're looking at there, the inability to plant the crop includes situations such as lack of water expected to be available by the final planting date for irrigated crops, lack of soil moisture, or sufficient soil moisture by the final planting date for non-irrigated cropland, or if the cropland was underwater at the time of the final planting date. Now, we don't have widespread flooding going on in Kansas right now. It's more drought prone in a large portion of the state. But prevented planting, it cannot be approved because of a management decision. Prevented planting also needs to be reported to FSA within 15 calendar days after the final date to be considered timely. And if producers have crop insurance, they should also notify their crop insurance agent about being prevented from planting.
And is there a way that producers are able to show their intention to plant this crop?
Yeah, so if proof is needed, they could show purchase receipts for seed or fertilizer, chemicals, different kinds of inputs, that kind of thing.
Obviously, we're talking about the different drought programs that factor in when we have a drought, which we are currently having in Kansas. However, there are many other FSA programs out there and available. What are a few of those different programs?
So, several counties right now in the state of Kansas are in D2 or higher drought situation. So producers could be eligible for the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, or they may even be eligible for Conservation Reserve Program, Emergency Haying or Grazing. Eligibility criteria is unique to each county, so just because one county is in drought D2 level, a neighboring county may not be, but producers can contact their local FSA office to inquire about the drought status in their county and possibly what programs they may be eligible for. Also, FSA currently has the Emergency Relief Program Phase 2 and the Pandemic Assistance Revenue Program. You may hear these referred to as ERP2 or PARP. Those programs are currently ongoing, and the deadline to sign up for those is June 2nd. Both of those programs are revenue-based to assist producers with revenue shortfalls. ERP2 is due to weather-related instances, and PARP is due to revenue shortfalls due to low market prices during the COVID-19 pandemic period. And then also we have the Conservation Reserve Program grassland sign-up currently open, and that runs through May 26th, which allows producers to make offers to enroll their grasslands, such as pasture or hay meadows, haylands, into long-term CRP contracts.
Michael, you've touched on a ton of different programs today, and if producers are wanting to learn more about those programs, what are some different ways they can do that?
So a good way to find out more about FSA and the programs and things that are going on, producers can learn more about those things by visiting on the internet www.farmers.gov. Also on that website, towards the upper right-hand corner, there's a service center locator on the farmers.gov website. Producers can pick that, and then you can pick your state and or county to find out what your local service center may be in your area.
And Michael, we have 105 counties in Kansas, and you said there are 96 county offices. So more than likely, your county does have an FSA office.
Yes, like you said, we have a presence in 96 out of the 105 counties. And even the counties that don't have a physical presence with brick and mortar in the building, we do have personnel that service producers from those counties. So no matter what county you're at in Kansas, you can find your nearest service center to provide you with resources and information.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today to share with producers and people across Kansas the different programs that the Farm Service Agency has to provide for them. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I was happy to share the information today.
That was Farm Service Agency Agricultural Program Specialist Michael Martin, and he shared about different programs provided through the Farm Service Agency, especially programs that are pertinent to our current dry conditions in Kansas. If you would like to find out more information on those programs, you can go to www.farmers.gov. If you would like to talk with someone in a farm service center, you can find a location nearest you by going to www.farmers.gov and going to the upper right-hand corner. The link to the Farm Service Agency website will be found in today's show notes, which, as always, you can find the podcast for today's show on agtoday.net. We are going to a short break, but we will have more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Farm Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti because recently we've experienced some low temperatures. In the last several weeks, we've had some lows that have left some worried about recently planted crops such as corn and soybeans. So, Ignacio, who better than to have you join us today and talk about this?
Thanks again for your invitation. So, the start of growing season is promising a lot already. Dry conditions, few rains, not much. We're still waiting, hopefully, for more rains. Subsoils in many situations are completely dry. As you look at the crops today, they are just depending on the rain. Every rain event is helping most of the crops that are establishing right now and getting to establish. So on the moisture, we are still kind of on the low end, more on the subsoil level. If you look at temperatures, interesting to see now, kind of how we send the message around early April, mid-April, that looks like summer. Let's get out, let's start planting, and then many of the people start looking at the number of suitable days, lack of rains, and then they start putting that corn. In fact, if you look at this last week progress report for corn, I think that we are close to 24% of all the corn acres already planted in Kansas. So very large progress in the last couple of weeks only. We were very warm on that end, and then I would say 2 weeks ago, we have just a cold spell. And then the questions that we have, last week for many farmers was what could happen. And then we had a few discussions about, okay, what are the potential implications on these cold soils and what are the implications in terms of the established crop. And if you want to go to recap on the weather, so we were looking at, in many situations, if you look at the map for the weekend that was April 22nd, and then we have until April 23rd. So we put a map on our EUPDATE article, and we put a number of hours in the map below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. When you look at the map, you will see a lot of purple, and sometimes a lot of purple might be not that good.
We're used to celebrating purple around here, but in this case of this map, it's not something you're hoping is in your area.
Yeah, and most of the times, when you look at a lot of purple, more purple means more hours under that kind of a freeze event. If you look at northwest and north central parts of the state, and if you look slightly towards northeast, you will see that we have in some situations about close to 7, 8, 9, 10 hours below freezing, which when you start thinking about the implications, most of the implications are for these kind of a more recently planted crops, and mainly we talk about corn and soybeans. Also, there is some implication for those that were planted a couple of weeks ago, because if you look at the temperatures, those that were planted quite early, they make enough progress that most of them, they probably already have a second leaf or unifoliates on soybeans. So, and then those plants, they will become a little more independent of the initial stages. If we want to go first to corn, most of the initial stages corn is quite susceptible to any cold stress, and mainly is quite susceptible during the initial hours after planting. 24, 72 hours after planting, that seed is starting to imbibe water, and that imbibition process, basically absorbing water from the soil and creating basically kind of that germination process, that is a moment that is the most susceptible. When temperatures go really low in dry soils, then you start seeing that they might produce that kind of what we call the chilling injury. There are multiple ways and shapes and forms of chilling injury. And depending on the temperatures, if you look low sections of the field, you might see potentially more impacts. If you look in upper sections of slopes on the field, you might see less impacts because they are more exposed. The residue cover is also another factor that can mitigate based on buffering. If you have some residue and if the seed is under 1.5 or 2 inches, then you have some buffer because that kind of a residue plus soil temperature. And as we know, that air temperature is usually lower, but soil temperature will be a little bit higher. So it's a buffer, but we still will see some potential challenges. So far, in many cases, for some of the crops, when we're looking at corn, early season, like when they have just like the first leaf, we have seen some kind of a cosmetic damage. And in many situations, the growing point is still not up above the ground. So that means that the plant, most likely, if it's a kind of a leaf burn damage, will reduce the growth, will kind of slow down, but it will potentially recover. One of the main questions, on the corn side is when is the optimal time to start looking at what to do with that? And then we always say that it's usually around 7 days based on the temperatures that we have last week. So after that weekend, closer to May 1st, and I think that could be an optimal time to start looking at get out and check to make sure that these corn plants are basically producing new leaf. And then when you are looking at these corn plants that they are moving into new and producing new leaves, everything is okay. When you start looking at these plants that they are not recovering and you see plants in many sections of the field that they are not recovering, you need to start thinking about what to do next. It will be very unlikely to see a lot of dead plants because, although we have many hours in many fields, I will say that in many situations in corn, if we have just in the stage with one leaf, we are safe. For that corn that got planted 2 or 3 days before these events, those are the ones probably I will put more attention. Because in those situations, you might expect potentially not coming up, and then potentially one of the best way to start scouting for that is looking, digging, and just check on the seeds to make sure that they are doing okay or not. And you will start seeing some potentially deformation when they are growing, part of the effect on crooking the plant as it's emerging. So, some of these effects, connected even with some potential compactions on the upper section of the soil, are situations that we need to put attention at this point, scout the fields, and make some assessments. Then when we switch to soybeans, a little bit different the situation. On soybeans, the planting progress, based on that moment until that time after the freeze event was still low, so we were around close to less than 5%. So most of the planting was done on some of the northeast section of the state, a little bit on the south central. Most of the area that could be worrying me more is most of that northeast. And similar to what we discussed before, this is a good time after 7 days, freezing event, to go out and start scouting. And the situation is a little bit different on the soybeans compared to corn. On soybeans, similarly, we will say that if you are just planting the crop 2 or 3 days before this event, that it could be a problem because that kind of a chilling injury it could be there too. Then the other cases for those plants that were planted maybe a few days, and then you start seeing the cotyledons. And some of the ways for you to assess damage, you will see that in these small stems and cotyledons, you will start seeing kind of a yellowing. And then if you see a lot of yellowing and it's covering the entire cotyledons, that is a symptom that those cotyledons are dying. And it's a symptom basically of an impact of the cold stress. If you don't have any other leaves, then you need to make an assessment because if cotyledon got impacted and they're completely dead, there will be less chances of survival for that plant. The other scenario is if you have already unifoliates. For those ones that they planted a little bit much earlier, that they already have above the cotyledons the first true leaves, then you are a little bit more independent because that plant is already moving. And most likely, those plants, even when you see some effect on the cotyledons, if you have those leaves, most likely those plants will recover. Again, most of the times, my advice, before you do anything or before you take any decision, you need to get out to the field. You need to start scouting different sections of the field because we'll have different impact on temperature based on residue, topography if you are in lower upper sections, and make an assessment. I think on soybeans, so far what I have seen in central east part of the state, most of the damage is a little bit cosmetic. We might see some plants potentially not emerging for those that were planted early, but on the assessment we need to probably get a large number of plants so they are not live in order to really start rethinking about planting or replanting those fields, because I don't think that we will get to that point. It's just another lesson from the weather from this year.
Challenging one, to say the least, is if we didn't need another challenge thrown our way on top of everything else. So you mentioned, it needs to be a significant number of plants that are damaged. So what is that, 40, 60%? What are we talking here?
It depends on the crop. That's an excellent question. For example, when you look at your response to number of plants in the field, in corn, you might expect that those numbers probably are a little bit lower. Like, for example, if you start missing 20, 25% of the plants, then you start knowing that you are losing yield. The main point is to also look at the pattern. If you see an area of the field like a low spot that is completely dead, it might make sense to take care of that because you know that nothing is coming out. If you see that it's a little bit random, it's really hard, and it's something that we might need to live with that during the rest of the season. And sometimes, even in situations that you are around 10, 15%, you are not in a bad spot. You are still kind of within the optimal plant density, or say in some way. On soybeans, we have the situation that we need to see substantial reductions. Because soybeans are very plastic, so they can branch. We have seen some reduction on plant density, but needs to be at least, in some cases, 20, 25 or more %. And again, scout, take a look to the pattern to see if this is just erratic and only just a few plants in the field, or if it's concentrated in one section of the field where you might say, okay, if it's 10 acres in one section of the field, might make more sense because you know that you are leaving that just for weeds to take over.
Well, great insight here today, Ignacio. And you mentioned earlier this is an Agronomy e-update article as well. So listeners, if you're tuning in and looking for more information on this subject, you can, of course, find that in our show notes on agtoday.net. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation, as always.
Once again, everyone, that was Farm Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti joining us today to talk about recent low temperatures and the effects on planted corn and soybeans. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
You're tuned back in to Agriculture Today, and we end today's show with this week's BCI Ask the Experts. This week we are joined by Brad White, Dustin Pendell, and Brian Lubbers.
Hi, welcome to BCI Ask the Experts. I'm Brad White, joined by two experts today, Dr. Dustin Pendell and Dr. Brian Lubbers. Good morning, guys.
Morning, Brad.
Good morning. And on today's episode, after I ask you guys the question, you'll get up to 10 points each for your answers as we go forward. So this question is a good one from a listener, and it says, there are multiple disease challenges that my operation faces. How do I prioritize, or what is important? What makes a disease more important than another one? Brian, I'm going to turn to you first on how to start prioritizing some of the disease challenges.
The little bit of my answer is strategy, because I know Dustin's sitting over there. So I'm going to say that animal welfare is one of the priority factors that you should think about as you start addressing disease challenges in your operation. And for one, we want to be good stewards of the animals we have. So that's an easy one. Two, welfare challenges are becoming more important for marketing and consumer reasons, so it has that impact. And actually, for a third reason, and we've heard this from several veterinarians that we work with recently talking about stewardship issues. When you're the person that sees the disease every day, it actually has a psychological toll on you. And so I think, and for me, all of those reasons fit under if I'm going to attack a disease challenge, I'm going to take the welfare angle to prioritize which one is the one I want to take first.
Absolutely. And I think great points there, because you're talking about the welfare of both the animals and the people. So it doesn't have to always be a severe disease, but it could be one that causes welfare issues but is common.
Right. Yep.
Excellent. 7 points for Brian at the start. Dustin?
And so the welfare, one thing I do like about that is obviously there's economics built, as you noted, with consumers, but then if an animal isn't, from a welfare standpoint, it's going to cause you economic costs. And so I guess my answer is a little broader, and I'm going to take a look at the costs associated with the different diseases that are possibly going to be on my operation, and then the benefits of controlling those diseases, and try to kind of do a cost-benefit ratio. The other thing I would add is I would also take into account the probabilities of getting onto my operation. So I'm not going to pick a disease that could be really bad, but we haven't had in 100 years. And so I would take into account the economics, costs and benefits, but then the probability of me actually getting that particular disease on my operation.
Oh, I like that. So I have to know my area and what my risks are and would it come on or not. So I don't want to try to control for everything out there what's most likely. All right, so 7 points for Dustin as well. So Brian, as you create that prioritization list, you mentioned welfare. What about the consideration of how easy it is to either prevent or treat? So would I be less worried about it if it's easy to treat, or should I try to still prevent things? Where's your take on that?
Yeah, I think ease and availability of effective treatments certainly plays into that decision, right? If I have something that, even if it's more common, if I know I can treat it, I'm probably going to treat it effectively. I'm probably going to put less emphasis on that. And we always emphasize prevention. So if I have means to prevent the disease, and Dustin mentioned preventing it from even getting on my operation, and I was thinking more of diseases I already had. So, but yeah, anytime I can control the disease through prevention, usually it has positive, productive aspects to preventing it before it causes a problem. And from an antibiotic stewardship perspective, if I don't have to use antibiotics, that's a way better path for us forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we can minimize the need to treat, we're way better off than if we have to treat it after the fact.
Yep.
So Dustin, as you think about prioritizing disease, you mentioned cost, benefit, likelihood of getting on my operation. Any other considerations that you'd have if you were prioritizing both disease in relation to prevention and treatment?
The only thing maybe that would come into play, but it's probably already being built into the costs and the benefits, would be, contagious. I mean, is it a contagious disease? Is it spread across the entire herd, or in maybe my neighbor's herd, et cetera? Or is it, will it get in maybe just one animal, two animals, just a few? So I think how contagious, how fast will this...
Magnitude of impact, right, within the herd, absolutely. So Dustin finished up with 8 points. Brian, you got 9 points. So thanks for that listener question. If you have any other questions for us, you can always email us at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, that was this week's BCI Ask the Experts. We will be back with more on Agriculture Today tomorrow.